So the first question that came in was with regards to the first talk by Pete Youngman about the amazing new roost that's been built recently in East Devon, and that was from Sam Pickering. And the question was, Pete, so what do we know what the humidity levels are in the new roost that has been built? If Pete is still here.
No. We haven't monitored the humidity. I must confess, we've been monitoring temperature, but not the humidity. And I was interested in Tom's saying that his cool towers are being used for hibernating bats, and I was wondering whether humidity might be a factor that we could add some water to our cool tower in the winter and see if it got used for multi-purposes, really. But I'd be interested to know people's opinion on the importance of humidity, particularly if it was, I think it was designed primarily as a summer roost, rather than hibernation.
Yeah, I think humidity is quite important, Pete, particularly if bats are going to be torpid in these areas for quite a long time. I think so. In quite a lot of our sites, we have like a bare earth floor, and there's a couple in Ireland where they have the rainwater feeding into the middle of the cool tower, so the ground is basically kept moist throughout the winter. So there's a couple of ways you can kind of raise the humidity levels.
Yeah, we've got a bare earth floor. Be interesting to do some monitoring.
In care, horseshoe bats seem to need the higher humidity, otherwise their wings begin to dry out, which is why I kind of asked the question.
Well, that's not a problem in the summer. They're in roosts of 30, 40 centigrade sometimes, and they'll last 20 hours. So it is a matter, as Tom says, of if you want your roost to be used in the spring and autumn, you've got to give them quick access to a cool region as well as to warmer regions. It's as he said in his talk, you've got to give a choice. Pete, did you have the opportunity to dig out the floor and make any underground structure, or were you on solid rock?
So we didn't dig out we didn't dig out the floor, only for the footings of the building. So yes, yeah, because we've got Beer Quarry Caves as our main hibernation location. I guess hibernating wasn't high on our thought list as we were developing the roost.
Oh, how far away is it?
In a straight line?
Yes.
2.5 miles.
So it's, yeah, somewhere sort of within 100 yards is always very handy, but okay. Then maybe that could be done as a separate, if you've got a place where you could dig into a bank and make an underground structure. You don't need much. Woodchester, we created 9-meter tunnels into a hibernation site with 180 lesser horseshoes in it. So, okay. Yeah. Anyway,
sounds like we need a digger.
That's really useful. Thank you for all the inputs from everybody on that one. There was another question actually, Pete, on the topic of that new roost, and that was from two people. So Stephen Prowse and David Appleton were both interested in knowing what the cost of the roost was and how it was actually funded.
Okay, so it's spoilt £20,000. I think mainly because we were on a greenfield site with very difficult access, so obviously that increased costs. Everything had to be, all the materials had to be transferred tractor and trailer and taken across 3 fields and unloaded by hand, etc. I'm sure if we'd been building a similar structure adjacent to a development site, we could have done it for a lot less. And also think that with East Devon being quite an affluent area, perhaps builders weren't necessarily looking for a lot of work, and this was not a mainstream thing for them. So I think, you know, maybe we've got 5 quotes, but, you know, potentially other areas of the county might find more builders more raring to go or to take up. And how do we fund it? Broadly, in thirds. So a third from the Batworks element of the Devon Greater Horseshoe Bat project. So through all the funders that the project, third from our biodiversity budget, and a third from the AOMB East Devon Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty has a sustainable development fund, and we got a third from there as well.
That's great. Thanks, Pete. Okay, and now we're just moving on to some questions for Tom as well. So does the Vincent Wildlife Trust do anything to increase humidity of their cool towers to encourage hibernation? So that sort of links in with the earlier question as well.
So the cool towers, the ones that we have are primarily for lesser horseshoes, and they're not they don't tend to be used for long periods of time. They're more used as like a cool area that bats would go to for a short amount of time. So the humidity is not high, but it's certainly not as it's not low. It's certainly not as high as you would find in a limestone cave, for example, or something like that. But as I was saying before, there are things you can do to increase the humidity in sort of like a larger cool structure. We'll have like open bodies of water at the base, or a gravel floor that's fed in through rainwater or something like that. But it's not always necessary. It depends on the nature of the building.
That's great. Hopefully that answers your question, Pete.
It does, yeah.
So
our landowner is saying he's got somewhere I can dig a nice into a marl pit to make an underground site for hibernation. So yeah, thank you for that.
That's great news. So we've got a question now from Keith Cohen, and this is also for Tom. And it was just a question really regarding where the horseshoe bats that were sort of made into refugees from the barn owl that inhabited the roost. So you mentioned that some of the bats went to the roost in Buckfastleigh, but the question was, do we know where the other bats went to?
So the short answer is no. I believe they'll have dispersed out to a number of different roosts, but I did some asking around, and no one really came forward to say they noticed any sort of sudden increases in the area. One of the delegates here might know something more, but I spent some time trying to figure out where they went and couldn't get a clear answer. So I expect they probably distributed amongst the other roosts in the area, but they didn't breed in High-Marks Barn this year, so they must have reared pups somewhere else. It's only after the pups were flying independently that they've come back. So as I say, I hope they breed there this year, but where they've been in the meantime for the past 3 years, at the moment, it's a bit of a mystery.
Great, thanks Tom. And then so the next question we've got from Julian Slater, and that was also to I think to Tom, and that is in developing new roosts, is there information to inform the size of maternity roosts to the numbers of like greater horseshoe bats that it can support? So I think effectively, is there a size of maternity roost that would be looking to build that would host a certain number of bats?
There's a number of different factors, and it's fair to say that all of our sites that populate close to and upwards of 1,000 bats are all quite large. But having said that, you can get significant numbers in much smaller roosts. So I certainly don't know of, say, a magic number. I think what's important, size is important, but also structural diversity within the site is equally as important. So I don't think that there's a magic number for greater horseshoes. Certainly lesser horseshoes will take up very, very small buildings, but the sort of traditional roosts are all big buildings, but I wouldn't say there's sort of a magic number now.
Okay, I wonder whether
Certainly not that I know of.
Okay, no, and Carol, I don't know whether you had anything to input to that question as well from your talk.
No, I don't think we've got the minimum figures that we've got work well for horseshoe bats, and appear now to hold some credence when it comes to brown long-eared bats. That study wasn't really focusing at all on horseshoe bats. It was looking at the more common and widespread. But the experience of finding that horseshoe bats, where they're provisioned, have a greater uptake. I still, brand new is, I would say, difficult to get it right. Even if you get the dimensions right, it's not always taken up. Although horseshoes, I know Roger will agree, are very nosy. All bat species are pretty nosy. They will find it, but the type of use they'll make of it can sometimes take years. In the ones that I've known, which tends to be rather more lessers, and lessers, as we were just saying, do actually take up very little room. And I think there's no, I won't, I'm then posing a question. I saw something talking about lessers and graters and what it's like to be bedfellows sharing the same roost. And I think if I can just answer a question that wasn't put as Reed, but it's a really interesting one, I would say, and others will disagree with me, that the jury's still out on that. Because I know cases where people have seen a change when graters have come along, where previously it had been lessers. And I also know and have my own where they've cohabited relatively peacefully, as far as we can tell, without changes in their use over a period of time. So yeah, just an interesting point that I saw down in the comments there.
Yes, and that is echoed, isn't it, in some of the comments about, this conflict between different species and conservation. Obviously, we don't want to be reducing barn owl numbers, but these horseshoe bat roosts are few and far apart. So
we did put a barn owl box up for anyone that's worried about the barn owls. They're in good habitat, so they were all right.
That's a great reassuring comment.
Am I right in thinking, Tom, that you're hoping to look at that interaction at VWT between lessers?
Yes, so I do have a project in the pipeline looking at the interaction between the two species, because it's certainly something we've noticed at our reserves, where there are some instances where very small numbers of greater horseshoes can turn up, and you're talking one or two, and then colonies of 200 strong lessers will completely abandon the building. And then other circumstances where they'll cohabit to a degree, but perhaps lesser numbers will go down, but not to a severe extent. And other examples where they cohabit and both numbers go up. I think there's something there in terms of structural diversity in the building. So if the lessers have got somewhere enclosed that's quite difficult for the graters to maneuver in, the lessers will go in there. There's one roost that's in the Forest of Dean that's a good example of that, where there's a huge building that the graters roost in, but the lesser horseshoes, the entire colony of breeding lesser horseshoes will just inhabit an enclosed chimney stack. There'll be 100 of them just in this tiny little space. So I think there's something there where the lessers have space where they can get away from the graters within the building. They'll stick around, but it's still very much under research at the moment. So yeah.
Woodchester, we've got 400 to 500 lessers and 200 odd graters adjacent to each other, and we just put an excluding slot, so that it's about a letterbox size, and only the lessers can get through it. Graters can't, and that seems to solve the problem. They both go out through the same exit hole into the brewery and then out of the building. So once they fly out, there isn't a problem. But certainly in a roost, there have been sites where they've shared the same loft, but they've been huge lofts. There was one at Mel's that was burnt down, unfortunately. But
I think space is a big thing there. If they've got enough space, I think perhaps they can cohabit. But what you said about the entrance is interesting, because the examples I know of where there are both species, they have separate entrances to the building that they use almost exclusively. It's really quite interesting to do an emergence survey, because you'll have each species exclusively using a separate entrance. So it's interesting for me to hear that you only notice that within the building, and you've managed to separate them within the building.
Well, they have no choice but to go out through the same exit hole into the brewery. But when they get into the brewery, the graters go out through a large exit hole exclusively, and the lessers go out through several small alternative exits, which are just around the corner. So they are segregated when they actually go out from the building.
Well, this is all really interesting. I wonder whether we can continue this discussion actually in the networking session at the end, because it feels like there's loads to be said about it. But I'm conscious that we have got a few more questions to get through as well. So we'll just move on a little bit now. And so the next question was from Pete Youngman actually to Tom, and just asking whether the designs for the barn owl baffles that appeared to be so effective are available to copy in case they are needed in other locations.
So we will be writing that up as a paper for conservation evidence eventually, but in the meantime, if anyone has any particular cases where that's of interest to them, they can get in touch and I'll be happy to share those designs.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so another question now from Julian Slater again, and that was just asking whether you know, Tom, it's this view again. The bats seem to have returned in high numbers reasonably quickly to Highmark's barn. Is this something that you were expecting, or was it something that you think was actually quite a surprising occurrence?
We were expecting it. I think particularly in buildings like that where there's been a colony present for, in that case, about 30 years, the majority of that colony will have roosted there within their lifetime, and there was evidence of bats still night roosting there whilst the barn owls are present. So they were still coming and checking it out. Perhaps it just took a period of time where they recognised that it was free again for them to come back. But looking at other population crashes in our data that have happened because of disturbance, once that's taken out of the equation, the numbers do tend to recover quite quickly. If they're the same animals that have been there within their lifetime, they'll come back quite quickly.
Interesting. Thank you. So we've got another question in now for Carol from someone called Ross Baker, and it's just talking a little bit about some of the information that you gave in terms of the new buildings not being as favoured by bats as some of the older ones. But did the study look at the location of new buildings in relation to bat habitat at all?
Yeah, it's something that was considered, but I would be honest and say there wasn't enough data, partly because we were going in that number of years, what was it, 2006 to 2014 after, so we had to rely on what was recorded before. And the things that we see as potentially important there are changes in the habitat, obviously around the roost area, anything like connectivity or just general foraging, but in particular connectivity, and of course lighting. And there just wasn't enough data to really draw much from that. I think we could narrow it down because actually all of those sites were pretty much in rural areas with good habitats and good connectivity away from the roost area. So I think if anything had changed, it would be more likely to be the lighting. I don't think it was the habitat, more likely lighting that we couldn't rule out and really would be useful to do as a study or to have recorded at the baseline, so that it's easier when you do ever go back to try and attribute change, to have lighting as an element you can actually consider.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Okay, and so we just got time for a couple more questions, I think. So a question came in as well from Stephen Prowse, and it's just asking really again about this of the new buildings and how they don't seem to be as favoured. And that is, has anyone tried using reclaimed building materials, especially timber, when building new roosts and new houses for bats, and whether that has any sort of implications for bat usage?
Yeah, in this study, I think some of it was, I wouldn't say it was all reclaimed, but there were elements in the new ones that had some older timber that was, you could say, reclaimed. But I think there's more talking about something where you're really doing the whole thing with reclaimed timber, and so it hasn't got that newness about it. And we didn't have that, but I have known where that's been done, and it still doesn't appear to be the secret element. I mean, there've been over the year, and I'm going off piste here, this is not in our paper, it's sadly in my small head, but there have been ideas like seeding it with droppings and just something. What is the element, if it's not everything that seems physical measurement and it's not external environment, as in habitat and lighting? What is it about that aging process? And I must admit that that point about using reclaimed timber seems a really sensible one. And I would sort of recommend it as a good place to start to rule out one of the other things that could be a factor. But I know it has been tried and hasn't, it might just be bad luck how often it's been tried. It has been tried and it hasn't had the outcome that you would hope for.
Thank you, Carol. And I think we're just going to have one last question now. And that is, well, I'll kind of combine the two last questions for Susan and Lily. And that is from Ross Baker. And that is, how does the CCTV sort of footage compare with standard infrared cameras when you're doing emergent surveys? And also, what is the sort of cost associated with those CCTV box camera sets?
Lily, do you want to answer the question about the surveys?
Yes, I'll start with that one. Obviously there's a number of different specs and models for both the CCTV and infrared. We did a completely unscientific test where we, the lesser horseshoe bat footage, we also had a more sort of cobbled infrared setup next to it, and we compared the footage afterwards, and the CCTV was notably clearer. It also sort of caught up with the lighting a bit more, because some of those DIY setups you have to put in additional illumination, and it's also just all fits together a bit neater, basically. I don't know if I can pass over to Susan if there's any more sort of technical information on that side, and then the costing as well.
Well, what I would say, compared to infrared cameras, CCTV is much more flexible and you have much more control over what you see. As Lily mentioned, you can mask things. You can also search in much more efficiently. So they are much more efficient, and also they can be left in situ on their own for long periods, which I have done for 4 months. I did go back every now and then to change the batteries, but they're much easier to deal with in that respect. With regard to costs, it's a bit like how long is a piece of string. You can get, on the whole, CCTV equipment is not very expensive, several £100 perhaps. As far as the plug and play kits which we've made, we're just working out the costs, but they'll be several hundred up to perhaps 1,000. But again, it depends very much on the power type you use, depends on the components that we use, but they're not much more than a good bat detector, put it that way.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, well, it sounds like there'll be a lot of interest now in CCTV cameras for emergent surveys. It does sound really useful. So yes, so thank you all the speakers from that section.